A little bit of a shorter show, but some really powerful things to talk about today. More evidence coming out, as you might expect, showing that basically the bottom line showing that what we're being told about the coronavirus, its origins, its timeline, everything about it, we're being deceived. Evidence is pointing in the direction, what we're going to talk about, another fantastic piece from Larry Romanoff from Global Research, diving through even more evidence that really does point to the direction that this did not start, at the very least, at the time frame they're pointing to in regard to China. That their suggestions are saying, based on the evidence, it seems it started outside of China and most likely in the United States, based on a lot of different things. But inside of this narrative, you could argue that that means that China just hit it from way before that, too. You could always make that argument. But what we're doing here is about data, the evidence, and where that points. Now, for those that want to suggest that by discussing the evidence that points away from China makes you some kind of a shill or propagandist for China, well, that's something I think you personally need to work out inside your own mind. Because facts are facts, evidence is evidence, regardless of where it comes from, regardless of where it points. And our job is to be objective, to recognize this, and also kind of, be smart enough to tie in the reality that the very government that we're screaming you can't blame right now unless you're a propagandist has lied to us about 100 different times exactly in situations like this, and has in fact conducted experiments on Americans unwitting as well as foreign countries without them being aware more times than I can count. This has to be brought into this discussion. And now, again, we're going to go back over some more information in regard to the origins, and it's coming out of more locations, not just Japan, not just Taiwan, not just China, but now Italy on top of all of that, more than we just discussed, is beginning to point to the same things that we're talking about. Now, one of these things you could ignore. Of course, a negative bad guy, Chinese adversary, of course you could ignore if you want to. You can dismiss these things out of hand. That's quite ignorant, regardless of where it comes from. You should do your due diligence and look at all of it, but that's what people do. But the moment that you get at least, we've got now 3 or 4 different U.S. allies that are absolutely saying, look, the data points away from what we're being told, and it doesn't point towards China. But no one seems to want to talk about that. Now, before I get into this first part, by the way, there's a lot of other things going on, a lot of different agendas being thrown in that we're going to go over. Venezuela's now, Maduro's being accused of being a narco trafficker, despite the fact that the U.S. is working out of Colombia, which sells 70% of the world's cocaine. We just don't care about the facts around here, it seems. But we're going to talk about a lot of things like that, as well as more evidence pointing to insider trading, meaning they knew this was coming, and meaning they all did, and they didn't do anything about it. And this is coming from big-time CEOs that apparently, again, sold a lot of stock right before all this happened. It's weird how that always seems to happen in this country, doesn't it? Doesn't seem odd to you? Hopefully so. But I want to start with something that somebody rightfully made me aware of, which apparently I made a big mistake yesterday. And this is important to talk about this kind of stuff. And first of all, let me make this clear. Without what I'm about to show you and the reasoning behind why I made this mistake, people can just simply make mistakes. They can just be completely wrong. People can not do their due diligence and share something without looking at, which in part is something that happened yesterday. And I'm happy to own that, because we can all make mistakes. The reality is, you, as always, the onus is on you. Do your research, do your due diligence, as I always say. Now look, the reality behind what happened yesterday, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. For those that may not even caught it, somebody has sent me this article in the midst of my preparation yesterday. And I thought, perfect, this is absolutely relevant. Now understand, what people didn't see, and what I actually didn't end up showing yesterday, was the fact that I was looking into Washington specifically. And in regard to their spike of flu, along with California, along with a lot of different places, New York, Maryland, all yesterday. So somebody sent me this in the midst of all of that, and I missed the fact that this says West Australia, not Washington. Okay. Now, the point was, I made the mistake of not doing my due diligence on this specific article. Totally my fault. 100% a lapse in my ability to do due diligence on this one article. Now, the point being is that it wasn't just that somebody sent me this and I said, perfect, it's what fits my narrative and I want to sell it to you. The reality was, I was looking at stuff like this. The reality of really seeing that there were a huge spike in Washington, as well as California, as well as New York, as well as Maryland, all this kind of stuff. Flu is affecting more people than usual in Washington and around the country. This is the point. I was looking in, this is Washington State, by the way. I was looking into a lot of this stuff. And the point was, somebody sent me this, and I made the mistake of saying, this is already what I was looking at, and this is the same kind of thing. And I really was more of an overarching point. But nonetheless, I made the mistake of not looking further into this. Now, had I done this without, already planning to have it be a short point and not having behind this, then that's a pretty bad thing. And the point is, as I made before, I'm not saying that's not something I'm capable of. Everybody out there is capable of making mistakes. Now, I hope you know that I do put hours and hours of long, nonstop effort into researching this stuff and making sure it's correct for you. That's what I pride myself on. But yet things like this will happen, which is why I provide the link for you so you can look and go, oh, looks like Ryan made a mistake. I hope you would also know that I am trying to bring you the best information as best I can. Bottom line is, do your research, because even people that are trying to tell you to do their research can also make mistakes. But the point still stands, understand, regardless of whether we're talking about a massive spike in flus around the same exact time frame in Australia, which actually adds more to this point of today, that we're seeing the same thing in Italy, in South Korea, in China, in everywhere. We're finding out this actually started long before the Western press was telling us it did. So this is even more interesting that it is Australia. But the point was, Washington is the same point. They did have a spike in flu, it did have a spike in deaths, and all the different stuff coming from the same time frame. But please, guys, recognize that we all are fallible. And anyone out there telling you otherwise is probably trying to deceive you for one reason or another. That's the point. Now, just so we're clear, I apologize that I made that mistake, and it's embarrassing. That should not happen. I should have done my due diligence on this one article. But hopefully you see what the point I'm trying to make and why it happened, and hopefully won't make it again. But please, always, double check everybody. Now, I want to start today with a fantastic article that really, really brings this home, the same kind of thing that we've been talking about. This is, I mean, the pieces just keep falling into place. Now, guys, this is more evidence. If we get to a point to where I'm willing to say that we can prove that this started somewhere else, or prove that it didn't start there, or however we want to put it, trust me, I'll say that. But if we're on the point of evidence, we have to recognize that that doesn't necessarily prove anything just yet. But evidence, the data points are really strongly pointing away from everything that we're being told. And unless we have a logical explanation for why that is, I think we have to acknowledge they're lying to us. That's very powerful, especially in the midst of the allegations of involvement here, which also we tie in a little bit today. As you can see, Larry Ramanoff doing an excellent job. COVID-19 targeting Italy and South Korea, the chain of transmission of infection. Now, this is, again, about the Italy. We just touched on the Italian story, the reality that Giuseppe Ramuzzi, the doctor, is now saying that they, just like in the United States, just like in China, just like we're now hearing from South Korea, that they did have this and stuff happening way back in September, December, November, before we were hearing about this elsewhere, which I think is, at this point, has to be impossible to ignore. And then it should also be a glaring red flag of suspicion why the U.S. government and its media propagandists continue to do so. Now, as he says, just as we discussed, a high-level Italian virologist, and this is Giuseppe Ramuzzi. Again, I think we've talked about this twice already, actually. This first part, anyway. Now, he's published in The Lancet and the others. This is the first one you're looking at. Oh, and by the way, for those that heard me mention yesterday, I did go afterward and post those Lancet studies on the pinned comment of yesterday's show, of all the different studies that China and multiple groups have been putting out in the midst of them, of everybody seemingly calling them lacking transparency. Now, they could be lying, but there's a lot of data being pumped out of there with zero coming from the other side. So take that for what you will. But I did post them for you guys to check out. But this Lancet image you're seeing here, this is the article, the study that we're talking about. They published these papers in the Lancet. Now, today's article, the Global Research article, goes over what we just covered, but also discusses many facts that Ramuzzi, the doctor, also brought forth that aren't actually being covered yet. Now, as I mentioned, Dr. Ramuzzi is stating right now that Italian physicians saw, quote, a very strange and very severe pneumonia, particularly in old people in December, even November 2019. This suggests that the virus was circulating, and this is coming from the doctor, at least in Lombardy, and before we were aware of this outbreak occurring in China. Now, you would think something like that should be very relevant to a situation that has yet to really flesh out. People still, which we're going to get to more in a moment, have not even been able to find patient zero, which is, again, we'll get to more in a moment. That's a big deal and doesn't make sense in regard to what, historically speaking, this process has done. That's being ignored. Again, that's a red flag. This is a huge data point now, especially now that it's been popping up in every other location we're talking about. Oh, weird. It looks like we all had a weird cough that wouldn't go away right around the time. We've heard this. This is everywhere. Now, Chinese medical authorities have determined the same underlying phenomenon, but of course, because coming from China, it's being dismissed. Now, of course, question everything, but to dismiss out of hand without looking at what they're presenting, that's just choosing to be willfully ignorant of the situation. You have to be able to look at these things to come to your own conclusions about them before you can then say, I believe this is actually not true. But you still have the data and you can still consider it later against other things. But to outright ignore it and just say, China bad guy, we're not going to look, that is being a propagandist for your own government. And understand, all governments are right now trying to propagandize the situation, including China. So there's reason to question that they could be making things up. But so we should be doing the same about the US government or Italy or Iran or anybody, right? That's the point. But they have determined the same exact underlying phenomenon here, that the virus had been circulating among the population perhaps for 2 months before it finally broke out into the open. Now, understand what this means is that this is not to argue still now that this is only China, it came from them, as Tom Cotton today is now saying that they need to be held accountable, of course, it's all their fault. Even they are saying, look, we also found out, we can also see that this started well before this. Which is interesting to contrast that with what the U.S. government is doing, right? The U.S. government is saying, no, that's nothing. Don't look there. They're China bad guy, propagandist. You're a Russian bot. Look over there, right? Don't pay attention to the obvious red flags of Fort Detrick and all the manipulation that took place there. And trust me, this gets far, far more relevant. Now, as well as Japan and Taiwan, right? Two staunch U.S. allies, each coming to the same conclusion with their respective individual research. Not combining, not working together, but different, not associated with the Chinese work, of their own accord, came to the same conclusion that this was circulating well before it was recognized in China, as well as the fact that their data is pointing to it all beginning in the United States months before this. Now, why is that being ignored? Seems wildly relevant to me. Now, according to the Italian National Health Service, the ISS, it says, quote, it is not possible to reconstruct for all patients the chain of transmission of infection. Most cases reported in Italy report an epidemiological link with other cases diagnosed in Lombardy, Emilia, Romagna, and Veneto, the areas most affected by the epidemic. Now, as Larry notes in his article, the above statement that I just read is of crucial importance since it supports in itself the assertion of several simultaneous infection clusters and several patient zeros. There are cases in Lombardy that could not be placed in an infection chain, and this must also be true for other areas. Given that the virus broke out separately in disparate regions of Italy, we can expect the identification of independent infectious clusters in those regions as well. That would mean Italy was hit by at least several individual seedings of the virus. That was his wording, seedings, which is very interesting. And this comes back to the same concept we just talked about in regard to the idea of the untraceable cases, right? That we saw in Iran, that we saw in a lot of different locations, which doesn't really make sense. It's one of many things in this long discussion that simply doesn't make sense. Now, China's outbreak of consequence was primarily in the city of Wuhan, but with multiple sources in the city and multiple patient zeros, with a minor outbreak in Guangdong that was easily contained. Now, China had multiple clusters in Wuhan. There was no single source, and no patient zero had been identified, which is similar to those of Italy. Now, Larry asked something that no one seems willing to consider in the West, and of course the mainstream media, which they control. Quote, was the Italian outbreak caused by infections from China? Yes or no? I mean, that seems like a pretty logical, basic question here. Was what we're staring at all the way over here caused by what we're seeing over here? Yet that is just a foregone conclusion. Does that sound scientific? Right? Please understand, for people listening out there, they have not proven this chain. They can't prove the patient zero. They can't prove how it jumped to Iran, Italy, any of these places. They argue that people transmitted it from there, right? But they can't prove that the secondary and these outbreaks that are being caused actually originated from China. That's very interesting. Now, before February 20th, there was only 3 cases of coronavirus infection in Italy. 2 tourists from Wuhan, China, confirmed on January 30th, and an Italian man who returned from Rome from Wuhan on February 6th. Again, this is the first part. There were clearly imported cases, with Italy experiencing no new infections during the next 2 weeks. Okay, so these are 2 different things. We're talking about the first little discovery of this before February 20th, right? And we saw, and they traced these cases back to rare things that were coming in from other locations such as China, or specifically China, right? So first off, this could have been the original issue that I'm discussing in the theory that I have, my opinion. This was the original issue, however that started. A leak, an attack, a manipulation, however we're talking about that story in regard to Fort Detrick or maybe leaking out of the Wuhan lab. This is something that happened, and it was less severe than this secondary thing we're dealing with, right? But whatever that might have been, that this was circulating in all these different places. We're seeing evidence of it in the United States, in Italy, in South Korea, in China, right? And elsewhere, before this was noticed in China. Like noticed meaning the media. So it was in China previous to that too. It seems China's data is showing us. However, then suddenly, after this 2-week period of no new infections, no cases, there appeared new infections that were unrelated to China. Right? They could not prove a tie back to this or any of the original people or to China. And they still haven't to this day. Now, on February 19th, the Lombardy Health Region issued a statement that a 38-year-old Italian man was diagnosed with the new coronavirus. The novel, this is the not to confuse with the two things I'm talking about. That's what they call it, the novel coronavirus, becoming the 4th confirmed case in Italy. Now, the man had never traveled to China and had no contact with the confirmed patients. All right, so this right off the bat is quite alarming for these people that are investigating in their locations. Never traveled to China, no contact with confirmed Chinese patients. Now, immediately after this patient was diagnosed, Italy experienced a major outbreak, which we're all seeing right now. In one day, the number of confirmed cases increased to 20. So we're told anyway. I understand these are numbers coming from governments and should be skeptical of, but this is what we're being told from the official sources in Italy, that in one day, the number of confirmed cases increased to 20. And after a little more than 3 weeks, Italy had 17,660 confirmed cases. Now, obviously, this doesn't add up. And anybody honest, including the Italian doctors that are talking about this and coming clean with the reality of the before story, even though their government's not really chiming in, as far as I can tell yet, there's something off here. And anyone honest like these people will show you that. Now, the Italians were not idle in searching for their patient zero. They were named the patient 4, Italian number 1. Now, why would they do that? And attempted to learn how he became infected. Clearly, they recognized that this sudden resurgence that had no tie to China was very suspicious. And they even labeled the 4th person number 1, because that's clearly what they thought, at least in this next evolution of this, was something that was number 1, not number 4, not continuing from the previous thing. Now, the search was apparently fruitless to find this, actually prove the patient zero. The article stating that, quote, America's pandemic of the century has become the subject of suspicion by Italians. Gee, I wonder why the mainstream media in the U.S. is not showing anybody that. Maybe because they've got a vested interest in maintaining a narrative, which is what their job is. Yet right now, all of the U.S. government, all they can say is, China bad guy, China lying, which, may be. But what about Japan? What about Taiwan? What about Italy? What about all the other evidence that's coming out that they're just pretending isn't there? Now, South Korea's experience was, as he puts it, eerily similar to that of what we're talking about in regard to Italy, and also to that of China. Now, the country has experienced 30 imported cases, which began on January 20th, again, which we're being told from their official sources. I believe all of which were traceable to contact with Wuhan or Hubei province. But then South Korea discovered a, quote, patient number 31. A 61-year-old South Korean woman diagnosed with the new coronavirus on February 18th. Now, this local patient had no ties to China. Had no contact with any Chinese people, and no contact whatsoever with any of the infected South Koreans. Her infection was a South Korean source, right? And this, again, is coming from South Korea, the officials. Now, just as with Italy, the outbreak in South Korea exploded rapidly after the discovery of this patient 31. Now, by the next day, February 19th, Italy was February 21st, for comparison. Understand the timing here. There were 58 confirmed cases in South Korea, reaching 1,000 in less than a week. After little more than 3 weeks, South Korea had 8,086 confirmed cases, so we're told. A question worthy of consideration here. Were South Korea and Italy simply, seeded at the same time? right? Because again, if you, as we go through this, and he points out in his article, if you actually speak to leading virologists and scientists around the world outside of the mainstream controlled circles, this doesn't make sense. And this is an obvious flag for something that doesn't add up for the normal trend. This is manipulation from the outside. Now, like the Italians, South Korea performed a massive hunt for the source of the infection of their Korean number one, combing the country for evidence, but without any success, just like everywhere else. Now, they discovered the confirmed cases in South Korea were mainly concentrated in 2 separate clusters, most of which, but not all, could be related to specifically patient 31. Not the first person they found in the country, but patient 31 out of all of them. Now, as with Italy, multiple clusters and multiple simultaneous infections spreading like wildfire, and without the assistance of a narrative about a seafood market selling bats and pangolins, or whatever they want to make it into be. Now, for both Italy and South Korea, Larry says he could also add that there is no supposed bioweapons lab anywhere within reach, as was the claim with China. Interesting, right? But that wouldn't actually be accurate. Why? Because there are indeed bioweapons labs easily within reach of these stricken areas, both in Italy and South Korea. But guess what? Guess who they belong to? You guessed it, the U.S. military. So once again, we have an obvious tie with no other biolabs in reach, except we just so happen to have one right within earshot. You could throw a stone and hit the roof of this building from each one of these major outbreak locations, not patient 1, but in fact, patient 4 in Italy's in regard to Italy, and patient 31 in regard to South Korea, both of which were later named patient 1. Why? Because there's obviously something different going on here. And weirdly, they're both right next to military biowarfare labs. Hard to miss something like that, right? I guess the mainstream media was just taking a day off. Now, Korea is particularly notable in this regard because it was proven that MERS resulted from a leak at the American military lab in Osan. Now, this is exactly what Dr. Boyle would say. This is exactly what many people around the world would say, that SARS, MERS, these things are bioweapons that were released intentionally. The evidence is there. The official Western narrative, of course, for MERS outbreak in South Korea was that a Korean businessman became infected in the Middle East, returned to his home, and spread the infection there. But there was never any documentation or evidence at all to support that claim. Weird. Sounds kind of like everything else we're dealing with in regard to the cover-ups coming from the very same people we're always pointing to. And to my best knowledge, it was never verified by the South Korean government either. So these are just claims floated by the usual suspects with absolutely nothing to back it up, like usual. Interesting how that works, right? Now, according to the Korean Yonhap News Service, at the onset of the outbreak, about 100 South Korean military personnel, 100, were suddenly quarantined. Where were they quarantined? Well, you guessed it, the U.S. Air Force Osan Air Base. Please don't miss the obvious connection here to see the fact that we have this weird outbreak, of course, been shown to come from the Osan area, and according to their own news service, they had an outbreak about 100 Korean military personnel who also were quarantined at the Osan Air Base. The Osan base is home to the Jupiter ATD military biological program that is closely related to none other than Fort Detrick in Maryland, both being U.S. military biowarfare research labs. There's just only so much that you can begin to overlook. Only so much that you can begin to just ignore. Now, there's also a very secretive World Health Organization sponsored International Vaccine Institute right nearby, which is, or at least was up until they suddenly realized people were paying attention, managed by the U.S. military biological weapons personnel. Now, at the time, given the quarantine mentioned above in his article, the event sequence accepted as most likely, even by the people in this area, was that of the leak coming from a Jupiter biowarfare project. Now ask yourself this: if this is the most likely scenario that was accepted by most people involved in the situation, why then is that not what we're told? Why? Because there's an obvious narrative here being controlled, managed by, I don't know, the Osan Air Base and the personnel therein that probably had some kind of an accident like they've had numerous times before and covered up, just like Fort Detrick, just like any number of things. Now understand, I'm talking about Fort Detrick before this whole coronavirus event. Yeah, that's a verified fact. as we continue to talk about. Not even just the one right before this started, where the CDC shut down Fort Detrick for contamination issues, or containment issues, I mean, right? Leaks, viral leaks. That's why Fort Detrick was shut down. And then we've got weird outbreaks of pneumonia and vaping illness we can't explain. Guys, this is obvious that something's going on. The evidence is impossible to ignore. What that something is, please do the research and come up with some theories, because it's not, the proof is not there yet. But what we can see is that we are being lied to. This is all being covered up. And the reality of this tie-in is that coming from, in regard to MERS specifically, and this tie-in with South Korea, you have an outbreak at the Osan Air Base where 100 South Koreans were quarantined. And this is exactly the location that's pointed to in regard to where this all started in regard to MERS specifically in this location. And then right next to that, you've got a World Health Organization sponsored vaccine institute. I mean, it just doesn't get more. I mean, this continues, but just this stuff is really hard to ignore, and no one wants to talk about this stuff. Now, the Korean path is similar with that of Italy. Now, if we look at the map of the virus-stricken areas of Italy, there's a U.S. military base within almost a stone's throw of every single one of them. Now, remember what Dr. Boyle said, that every single Ebola outbreak in Africa has been within a mile range of some U.S. biowarfare lab in Africa. Now, understand, there's a lot of them, but these, with how big Africa, the continent of Africa is, it's not some chickenpox speckled labs every 3 feet, understand? So for this to happen within that close of a range of every single time of a U.S. lab, guys, this is just statistically wildly unlikely, to say it very generously. So now again, we're realizing that it says the Korea path is similar, right? Because the areas we're talking about on the map right now, the virus-stricken areas of what we're dealing with, is almost a stone's throw away from every single one, or rather at every single one of these locations, a stone throw away is a biowarfare lab run by the U.S. military. Now again, how many things are we going to continue to not talk about? How many close tie-ins? I mean, look, if every single one of these events in history, let's just say, I'm not saying that's the case, but I bet you could make an obvious tie for that. But let's just say everything that's ever happened in history happened right next to a U.S. biolab. You know, ignoring for the moment the obvious historical problem with that, but just for the sake of analogy, right? That every single major viral outbreak in history has always come from a U.S. lab, or rather within close range to one. How do you ignore something like that, right? But then let's just say it was only, half of them. What if it was only the last 10, right? At what point do you start to go, wait a minute, this is just impossible. That every single one came right next to one of these labs. Maybe they did it on purpose. Maybe it's happening without them even knowing it. I mean, this is just obvious things that should be asked with this obvious tie-in, but is being completely ignored. And if you look at the mainstream media, we are wild tinfoil hat conspiracy theorists. Just like when we said that Duma was a false flag. Just like when we said that Afghanistan's war was all about lithium and opium and it's a major lie. Just like all the things we taught. Just like we said that the Bolivia coup was in fact a military coup. Yeah, guess what? We were right about all those things. But they also then still said we were crazy conspiracy theorists, just like they're doing right now. How does that still work? Now, as Larry rightly points out, this is, of course, merely a case of circumstance arousing suspicion, and by no means constitutes proof of anything at all. And that, guys, is the sign of a good journalist. Same thing we say on this show every day. All right? And I'm not even calling myself a journalist. I'm an aggregator of information. I'm a researcher for you. Now, there are times when I conduct in journalism and go out and research things, which I would call journalism, but I consider them to be different things. Now, others may say that that's different, but this guy, as others like him, who are taking the time to go out and research these things on the ground and write, and then take the time to say, look, guys, don't jump the gun. We still need more to connect the dots. That's what real, honest people do. Not someone who's trying to sell you on some narrative about something that clearly drives in the direction of beneficial ideas to him. Whether it's the two-party paradigm or selling you something, it's everywhere. So I cannot offer more praise for someone that's going to say something like that, especially with the article with some powerful points to make. Now, however, there's a major point here which cannot be overlooked. Namely the fact of simultaneous eruptions of a new virus in 3 different countries. 3 different countries. And in all 3 cases, no clear epidemiology where it came from, and an inability to identify either the original source or a patient zero. That, again, is just not, let's say, wildly unlikely. Now, as he says, multiple experts on biological weapons are in unanimous agreement that eruptions in a human population of a new and unusual pathogen in multiple locations simultaneously with no clear idea of source and cases with no proven links is virtually prima facie evidence of a pathogen deliberately released, he says. Now, just so we're clear for those that the term actually defined, prima facie, means based on the first impression, accepted as correct until proven otherwise. But understand that this is what we're talking about, guys, that a unanimous agreement that 3 different countries, multiple locations, simultaneous outbreaks with no proven links, no patient zero, evidence of a pathogen deliberately released. Since natural outbreaks can almost always be resolved to one location and one patient zero, the possibility of a deliberate leak is as strong in Italy and South Korea as in China. All 3 nations apparently sharing the same suspicions, both U.S. allies and not. But of course, this will all be Chinese propaganda, because that's just what happens when you dare to challenge the mainstream narrative. Simultaneously, by the way, I'm also a Russian shill and a Zionist shill, depending on however they want to spin it, right? Pick a lane, guys. It's crazy. But the point is, this stuff is impossible to ignore. And I know you guys out there watching this recognize that. And it's important for us to take the time to try to walk people into this. Spoon feed people the reality if it takes it. Because this stuff can't be ignored any longer. It's quite amazing to see this stuff. And so we can continue through this today. But the rest is only things that I just want to mention for you guys, and it's a lot powerful stuff. But even here's even a video from Business Insider of all places, Business Insider, from October 2019. You see the title? Inside the U.S. government's top secret bioweapons lab. Now, do you realize, guys, that the U.S. government has said more than once that they don't make weapons? That's, by the way, bioweapons are illegal. They signed the Bioweapons Convention Act. They're not allowed to make bioweapons, but that's why they pretend they're doing it to make vaccines, so it's kind of a sidestep. But realize that even the Business Insider has a whole video about how they have a U.S. top secret bioweapons lab, and we all know this. But guess what? There's more than you could possibly imagine. Sure, I see a piece of paper where the DOD will say, we've got 35, even though we know that all of those things should be shut down. I bet you it's a hell of a lot more than that. Here's Tom Cotton that I was just talking about. China unleashed this plague on the world, right? China unleashed this plague on the world, and there'll be a reckoning when we're on the backside of it. This guy is a problem. Now, if this turns out that this is something that started in China, well, then we'll find that out when the evidence comes. Does that mean that we should blame them for something? Such as like how the Spanish flu started in this country in the United States and everyone lies about that, or the fact that H1N1 started in this country, or any number of these things that absolutely verifiably started in the United States and spread around the world and nobody's ever apologized for it or done any reparations for it. I mean, these are things we're hearing today. And this is before even the data has actually officially fleshed out. People are still investigating. We haven't even found patient zero, and yet we've got members of the U.S. Congress screaming that they already need to apologize for something that we're not even sure yet. Guys, this is what an agenda looks like. This is what a narrative control looks like. They're doing this now, just like I think Larry said in one of his previous articles. They are always quick to jump up and grab the microphone to control the narrative the moment these things start. This was already happening right when this first began, right? That's clear. So it's clear that they had an agenda before anything really even started. That has to show you something. Now, if it turns out that China hid this, and you can tie them to it in a way that they actually did something maliciously, well, then absolutely. China's government should be wildly held accountable, right? But, so then should be every other government that's done similar things in the past. I'll just leave that floating there for you, as I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. But there's a lot here. An absolute lot. And this country is overwhelmed with the obvious manipulations coming from our own politicians as they're vying for their own political power and the overarching agenda, which they're all fighting for, it seems. But these are the very same people that failed to do anything for you, right? As we're dealing with all of this and as they're pointing fingers to everybody, guess who's still not prepared? this country. As Dan Cohen just said, on March 4th, the U.S. had only 1% of the 3.5 billion N95 respiratory masks needed for a full-blown coronavirus pandemic. That's 2 months after China told the CDC about coronavirus, and the government did nothing to obtain more. Right? Now, you could argue they did stuff. They passed acts and they said they were going to do this and they lied to us about that. Right now, guys, we do not have them. I was literally I just spoke to Star Wilson again from yesterday. And her story is getting even more ridiculous. And by the way, I'm only using this one specifically because I personally know Star. But regardless, I'm getting flooded with stories about this. About how they went yesterday to try to get a test and they told they didn't have them or they can't, right? Or going in and seeing these people without masks. The fact that these people in these hospitals are not prepared is wildly dangerous. But now we're finding out that they are being refused tests even as we're saying we have enough for everybody. And of course, we're finding out from anybody outside of the controlled narrative of this country and the Western media that other experts in other countries are saying, yeah, such as the German virologist, of course you need constant testing along with this. Otherwise, it doesn't work. Shocking. I could have told you that. But see, we're being lied to by the people who want to maintain that they didn't do anything wrong. And of course, they're well prepared despite all of the evidence saying otherwise. We're not. We don't have it. And as Star just said, she got sent home and was saying, we're not going to test you because you know why? We're going to treat you the same anyway, which by the way is not accurate. That just shows that they don't have everything they need, even in regard to treatments. But guess what just happened? Star told me today that not only was she sent home, but her roommate actually works at that hospital. And guess what happened? They sent him home because they were concerned that she was home and possibly sick. But they didn't test anybody. And possibly because they want to control the information flow that they're just telling people they can't get tested while they're telling everybody that everyone can get tested. Unreal that what's happening right now, guys. Unreal. Now get this. The World Health Organization, they just put a WhatsApp link. Anyone from anywhere in the world has questions about coronavirus, they can get a message and receive some information. Isn't that nice? Oh, but guess what? If you're messaging in Iran, well, you can't get in touch. You know why? Well, because it's Iran's boycott, and it's exactly medical services that excludes boycotts, right? So, yeah, so yet again, this is an example of how obviously Mike Pompeo is a big liar and how all of these things are absolutely hindering Iran and their medical aspects of what's happening today. This also is incredibly insulting, seeing as how Google deleted Iran's app for themselves in efforts to fight this, but are clearly taking their ideas and making websites and apps to fight this after the fact. But they deleted Iran's app that was only for them because sanctions, right? Because it's not affecting their medical aspects at all, because that's obviously not true. As I just showed you, lines of trucks with medical equipment being stopped in Bulgaria, I believe, because they said U.S. sanctions wouldn't allow it. That's happening. That happened yesterday. But sure, Mike Pompeo swears to you that nothing's getting through because Mike Pompeo's never lied to you before, right? That's crazy. And here we go, insider trading, Bezos and other corporate execs, guess what? Sold billions in stock before the rocked market. Yeah, just like, all the other, what was her, I forget all their names now. I'm trying to remember. There was, I believe, one Democrat, 2 Republicans, if it matters to you guys, part of the, two-party illusion. But I know one was Feinstein, and I know, dang, I'm forgetting their names now. The other two, anyway, but we know that multiple members of Congress, right after briefing, sold millions of dollars in stock and probably saved themselves a hell of a lot of money. And now we're finding out that other execs did. Gee, I wonder if Bezos, tied to the CIA, had any kind of inside information. I wonder if these other execs all knew something that we did not, including Lawrence Fink, CEO of BlackRock, sold $25 million of his company shares on February 14th. Guys, this is so incredibly obvious that they knew what the government refused to tell the American people. And now people like friends of mine are losing their entire businesses because they weren't made aware and they didn't give them enough time to take the actions they needed. I mean, that's one obvious potential reason why they dragged their feet. Because they wanted to get their own ducks in a row before they told everybody. And by the time they got their financial ducks in a row for their own inner circles, it was already too late to do what else needed to be done. But of course, that's all that was really important, is making sure their insider friends knew what was coming and they could sell their stocks and they could control everything. Make sure that they were ready. And then if they had time, make sure the American people didn't just, starve to death in their homes and all this, right? I mean, it's ridiculous. Now, this whole thing is so incredibly obvious that they took actions before anybody was even aware what was happening. This is why I can prove to you that they were warned. This is just one in a long string of examples where I told you the military told Trump, the Pentagon told Trump in the beginning of January that they saw an influx of cases, a rapid influx of cases, beginning of January. And yet they still pretend like we didn't know. We had no idea. Nearly half of all patients at this one hospital are confirmed or suspected coronavirus cases, right? That's what happens when, you don't have what you need. When medical individuals can't, as Tulsi Gabbard told us, that they have one mask, right? You got one mask that you have to save, every week, because that totally makes sense, right? I'm pretty sure I had the clip here so you guys can watch it again. I mean, I don't understand why this was just a couple days ago.
Per week. So they're working 12-hour shifts every single day. It's just, it's hard to fathom how this is happening in the United States of America and not in a third world country where basic protective equipment, same issue with the tests that they're still not testing the numbers of people that need to be tested so we can have a realistic view on how good or bad things are in this country. It is astounding to see the lack of foresight and proactive leadership.
Now, again, the clip was cut off from right at the beginning. I'm sure you can find it on Jimmy Dore's show as well. But she was just saying for weeks, like they have to keep one mask for weeks and keep it in a little bag. This is somebody she spoke to personally who told her all about it. I mean, guys, this is coming out every which way. And it's clear that people are not prepared. And not only that, it's also becoming clear as I continue to try to come up with new titles for the same concept of my videos that I put out on clips. Trump's task force is lying to you, guys. I mean, it's crazy obvious what we're seeing. And it's coming out even more that we're seeing this kind of stuff that, it's, you don't make that time. You don't make the timeline. The virus makes the timeline. Dr. Fauci contradicts Trump again, by the way. And this is the point. This has been back and forth, right? Dr. Fauci came out and obviously argued something that contradicted what Trump was saying. And this was in regard to the tests and that they don't have the tests. Then he disappeared for a day or so. And everyone pretended they're, he's doing this, he's doing that. And then he came back out and he contradicted him again. And this was on TV. But the point is that everyone's trying to force in this idea that we have to, look, to be clear, there is logic for arguing that at some point, the benefit will outweigh what potential let's put it like this. If it was possible that we would never dig out of this economic hole if we didn't start making changes to some degree at some point in time, and that was, all agreed upon, there's an argument to be made of how we might want to change things to make sure that doesn't happen. But the bottom line is, if people are still that sick, your life is more important than this economy, period. I don't know why that's even a discussion. American people will just like history, we don't need the government to tell us what we need to be doing. The American people will be fine. The life will go on, things will go past, and life will continue. But the point is that Trump is saying, the economy is important, and we're going to force this in after a couple of weeks. Even though it's not necessarily, he said multiple times, we'll see, right? Which is always what he does, which means then maybe when that comes, he'll say, yes, it's not right, we're going to keep the quarantine going, or whatever. So it doesn't mean that he's absolutely certain but the media is harping on it because that's what they do, trying to misrepresent and overhype one side of a, multiple-sided story. But nonetheless, Dr. Fauci is coming out and saying, look, guys, we don't decide this. The virus decides the timeline, which is, again, contradictory. So at the end of the day, it shows you how absurd it is that we're getting a different message from the very same task force. Talk about making panic. People right now they're being told they can get things that they can't. They're getting misinformation from the same task force and lie. It's crazy. And this is what's causing the problem. Now, however you want to look at this, the media is playing just as much a part in the manipulation and making people panic as the misinformation from Trump and anybody else. It's not a left-right problem, guys. That's the deception. Everyone's so focused on the politics and all of this that we're missing the forest from the trees. Every one of them are deceiving you right now. This is a massive manipulation. However you think this is actually going on. They are forcing in agendas left and right. And maybe, just maybe, the misinformation and deception and confusion is all part of it. Bottom line, though, you're not getting the full story. As Moon of Alabama points out, he say he's, kind of making a shot at MAGA, saying, hey, MAGA is successful because guess what? In a few days, they'll have the greatest number of COVID cases and the greatest number of casualties of the disease, which, we'll see. Hope I try to be a little more optimistic than that. When he says it's not a nice picture to make, and it makes him sad. He says more than $2 trillion the lobbyists told Congress to put into their 800-page relief bill, which, now is looking over $2 trillion, will mostly go to the very rich, which, again, is exactly what I've been saying. It is corporate socialism, a bailout for investors and managers. Now, this is his take on it, but the bottom line is that this is going to help the investors and the managers. It's not going to go, there's something will possibly trickle down after it's all been eaten up, the crumbs for the little people as usual. But this is a bailout, guys. Don't get that misunderstood. In the midst of this, even if it is helping companies that have been struggling, these are billion-dollar companies. And this is also a bailout for companies like Boeing that don't deserve that money. It has nothing to do with coronavirus. Nonetheless, they're doing what they want. Let's just contrast that with the Russian President Vladimir Putin, who in an address to the Russian people allocated most of the money for the unemployed and retired for the families. Now, again, for all those out there who are saying, oh, this guy's a Russian shill because he dares to talk about stuff like this, that's just a fact. Now, the reality is that I think this whole situation is creating a very dangerous problem where governments are forcing their way in very alarming ways. Even in regard to universal basic income and stuff like this. But in a situation like this, in a one-time problem where they're helping families and people that are suffering, I agree with that. But I don't like the idea of it continuing after the fact. But that's what I think we're driving to. But can you not see the contrast between what the U.S. government is doing right now and what Russia is doing for its people? Now, that may change, but at the moment, we are not the focus, guys. And at least on surface, he's telling people that most of the money is going, and he's linking to the information to the unemployed and retired for the families. Now, that's very different than what we're seeing. Now, look, I would say the same thing if that was anybody. If Israel was doing that, I would point out the same thing, okay? If it was Germany or Italy or anybody, I would say, look at them, that's a different response than the U.S., but because it's Russia, of course, that makes me a shill, right? That's how people talk today. And it's constant. But the point is, that's better than what we're dealing with. They're actually taking care of their people, and we're not getting the same. Now, again, that may change. And I've noticed that Trump seems to be reacting to this. Oh, of course, the real point in that statement is everything they're doing is reacting. They're being reactionary, not proactive. They're waiting for a problem, and they're reacting to it. And that's why they're failing. But same thing. Maybe Trump will see this and be like, oh, no, we can't look worse than them, and do the same thing, right? Now, it says the U.S., as well as other countries, is still not doing enough to slow down. Now, some of his mindset here on what they're doing, I disagree with, or rather what they should be doing. I again, constantly point out that I don't want to see a nationwide martial law crackdown, right? We need to quarantine problems and apply massive testing, right? Because people that are sick at this point, most of them would want to be tested and want to be kept from their families. They're not making everybody else sick. But see, in this country, we're saying, go in your house and lock yourself with all your family and just see how it goes. We'll see how it goes. That's a constant phrase we're hearing today. Now it says to send anyone who has mild symptoms home to be cared by their families only increases the speed of the epidemic. And as all family members are then likely to get the virus. Exactly my point. Tests and care for COVID-19 must be for free. I agree. We need hospitals to care for only the critical cases. We need quarantine centers to isolate the milder cases. Now, guys, this seems like basic stuff. Now, let me reiterate. All of this stuff can happen without a forceful martial law national lockdown. I do not agree with that. All of this combined with this kind of action, with constant testing, if any of this is what it seems, that is the right response. And everywhere else around the world is beginning to see that. But nothing seems to matter when these people in this government, whether it's past administrations or today, when they get something in their mindset, it doesn't matter what happens. It doesn't matter how bad it looks or what everybody else is doing. They're the leading shining star in the world, showing everybody else what to do, even though nobody's doing what they're doing, right? I mean, that's the point. Right? That's not, I don't mean specifically in this case, I just mean in a general sense. Because there are other people doing what the U.S. is doing right now. But I think it's becoming clear that it's not the right way to go. Now, in addition to all of that, what we're seeing around the world is lots of other countries continuing to say, look, even if they're going to come back to it later, that they're pulling back on their war efforts because obviously that's about the least important thing happening right now. Unless there's people out there that are, either created this to be able to make it more important or are using it to be able to force in their agendas, like certain people I'm sure you're thinking about right now. But other than those few cases, it seems like across the world, most countries are saying, well, we need to focus on what's going on. So France is withdrawing all of its troops from Iraq to fight the virus, right? Here's Russia suspending war games to slow coronavirus spread. All right, there's any number of examples about this all across the board, including mostly U.S. evil enemies, where they're going to argue are doing exactly what the U.S. is doing right this moment, the U.S. government, right? That's what they're always saying. Oh, they're going to use this situation to use this and do that. No, that's exactly what the U.S. government's doing. I can't see examples of anybody else doing that, other than the usual suspects of them and their allies, right? This is what we're pointing to. How do you explain that, right? It's always and this is the accuse them of that which you are guilty. Classic. This is like the number one go-to of the U.S. government. But as everyone else is kind of pulling back and winding down and focusing on their own problems, and again, on top of that, we've got Russia and Cuba and Venezuela and all of the, usual bad guy suspects for the U.S. government, right? All the people that are, not bending the knee and not allowing them to, rape their country of all their resources, because that's what makes a bad guy today. All of them are seemingly helping everybody they can. Russia's flying over different places and bringing equipment and helping people. I believe Russia just flew into Italy and brought all kinds of stuff to help that situation. Now, that's not happening from the United States. Except one thing that Pompeo said today, which I'll share with you, and I guarantee that's reactionary because of exactly what I'm saying. But here's the point. While all that's happening, here's what the U.S. is doing. U.S. Navy fires missiles in Philippine Sea, sending message to Beijing, right? Because that's what we need, right? Threatening messages to Beijing while clearly how does that even make sense? This is creating the narrative that this was a threat from China, right? That's what they're trying to say. The U.S. Navy launched live fire missiles, it says, in the Philippine Sea last week, in what is seen as a direct message to China. The guided missile destroyer USS Barry launched a medium-range standard missile according to the U.S. 7th Fleet. Right, so this is open. We did this, right? And this is inflammatory. This is them trying to create and maintain conflict and just ongoing animosity in the midst of a problem, and arguably to sidestep away from what we're actually looking into, the fact that it seems that they're involved in this to some degree. Now, there's plenty more, by the way. Every one of these fields every one of their war fields right now are increasing while seemingly everybody else is going away, downplaying, removing troops. Why? Because I argue that either they're clearly happy to use the suffering of other people to maintain their agendas and increase them, or possibly because this was part of the plan to do whatever they did to use it like they're using now, and as well as all the agendas that we're seeing forced in everywhere. Get this on top of it. U.S. indicts Venezuela's Maduro on charges of, if you can actually believe it, narco-terrorism. Because there is very little evidence to suggest that in any way that the government of Venezuela is involved with trafficking of drugs. Now, is there trafficking coming out of that country? Probably, like every country in the world. But here's the real point that shows you the absurd, laugh out loud absurd hypocrisy of the U.S. government, is that they're working with Colombia. The U.S. government is working out of Colombia, at least up until they were doing operations against Venezuela, and I know that they have presence there right now. And clearly, they're using these locations to work out of. Now, guess what Colombia is known for? You guys know, cocaine. Colombia sells about 70% of the world's cocaine. Colombia. And there's obvious, and I mean obvious, ties to the government. They don't care about that, but yet they're still willing to stand here and point to Maduro as a narco-terrorist, meaning drug trafficking, yet they're working out of Colombia because that makes perfect sense. Based on basically zero evidence, and they offered a $15 million bounty on his arrest. That is the point. We're willing to bribe people to remove this man that we've failed at removing because his people support him, because they don't want the U.S. to control their country. So they're basically saying, here's money. Any assassins and mercenaries out there who want to take us up on this offer, just kill him and we'll give you $15 million. Or, his arrest. That's unreal. Of course, this is because they know nobody's paying attention. U.S. imposes fresh sanctions on Iran, right? Oh, cool. Say this today, guys. more sanctions on Iran in the midst of what's going on, even as the UN and UK and seemingly everybody everywhere is saying, you guys are murdering people right now with those aggressive sanctions. They always have been, but now it's a little more untasteful because we're all dealing with coronavirus. So obviously this is disgusting. These people are disgusting, and they're hurting these people intentionally because nobody's paying attention. Kataib Hezbollah says that the Americans are planning something in Iraq right now, together with traitors in the Iraqi army. They also said that they will respond and that any site they attack of the resistance will become a cemetery for them and their traitors, right? This Kataib Hezbollah is arguing that the U.S. government is using what's going on to create some kind of government shift, which is exactly what they did before, right? Here's somebody else going on the same line of thought, saying they're arguing that the person that's nominated for prime minister is actually an American spy, which makes perfect sense of why they tried to aggressively force out Mahdi. The bottom line is they are using this situation to force in their agendas everywhere, and nobody's paying attention because coronavirus. And it's disgusting. I mean, it's like on its face, obvious, disgusting things. They just deployed troops, or they're going to Canada's border now, which of course upsets Canada, which I think is ridiculous in and of itself. Now we have more troops deploying inside the U.S. government, or excuse me, gosh, see, there I flip it around again. Gosh, I can't get a handle on that. Inside the U.S. in general, which is, a violation of posse comitatus, but who cares? Because coronavirus. But the point is, I argue he's doing this because of people like me, who pointed out how obviously stupid it was that he's deploying troops to Mexico's border because coronavirus, but then not doing it to Canada. Obviously, that was because the agenda was to have border troops ready on Mexico. Because one of the agendas, I promise you, is going to be regime change in Mexico. Or rather, just in general, to control it. And the flow of immigration, right? That's what that's about. So again, an agenda using coronavirus. But they did this because, well, we have to be equal, but that's reactionary, Trump, as usual. We already saw it. It's too late. But either way, it's a violation, and it shouldn't be happening. Now, here's the point I was talking about, of course, now on today, right? After we're clearly watching as Russia and Cuba and China are sending lots of stuff around the world to help people. Here's Pompeo with an afterthought. I'm pleased to announce we've made available nearly $274 million, which, is like peanuts compared to what's flying around, in emergency health and humanitarian funding. Our leadership in the coronavirus response is another example of how America continues to be the world's greatest humanitarian. Please force that a little harder, Pompeo. Go ahead and pat yourself on the back, right? And don't try not to, gosh, that's so frustrating to see, right? I would argue this country could and would be if people like him weren't getting in our way. If people like him weren't using that name to then go out and murder families, right? That would be a little bit better, right? To argue that this is going off of, Sean Penn's disgusting point, to argue that the military is the world's greatest humanitarian, that's disgusting. And this is him trying to sidestep that into just America. Because you don't blend those things, right? America is you and me, right? That's who it is. America's the people. The government is what he's talking about, not America. He's talking about the U.S. government. And they're not the world's greatest humanitarians. In fact, they're some of the largest world's terrorists in the world, right? I mean, this is just an obvious point, guys. They use force to effectively create to achieve political goals. Guys, that is the literal definition of terrorism. To achieve political goals using violent means. That's terrorism. Just because they've argued differently doesn't change that. That's the reality. The State Department can write whatever they want about the term. The term means what it means. And understand that that's not you. That's not the American people. That's not the U.S. country. We are the country. The government and what they're doing is obviously wrong. It's obviously bad. And for anyone that tries to calling out the crimes of your government un-American, you're un-American. The Un-American Act is blindly supporting a rogue government. The whole point of this country and what it was founded on was to be able to fight against such things. But people like you guys out there that are arguing we're un-American for calling out the facts are hurting this country. And sadly, they probably know that. But the reality is, guys, that people like this, hiding behind the idea of the greatest humanitarians, are disgusting, because what they're actually doing are continually hurting people, knowingly overthrowing countries, knowingly starving populations, knowingly destabilizing exactly what they need to survive so it achieves their goals. I don't know how anyone can even disagree with that. How do you explain saying it's okay that 500,000 children died in Iraq and it's totally worth it? Is that worth it? Obviously not. There's no, and especially now that we see how it didn't do anything, how it in fact made things worse and in fact created ISIS, which they then used in other countries. Guys, this is always what's been going on. It's time for us all to wake up. Now, to end on one more point that I thought was incredibly relevant, here's Iran offering $5 billion in cheap loans to buffer businesses from a pandemic. And guess what? This is why governments everywhere are a problem. Because why this is bad is the same way that the U.S. using $4 trillion to give loans to Americans are bad. Because what they're doing is just saying, here, take some more debt slavery. Here, continue to indebt yourself to us. How about these governments just take the money that they've been taken from you and then, just help you with it? Only in the midst of a crisis like this, and only because that's already what it is. I argue that the best thing would be them never to have existed. But because we're here, because they've already been taking tax money, and because they're holding that money, well then yeah, right now, because of what's going on, they should be just helping you. Not saying, here you go, here's a loan that we're going to make you, foreclose on your house next year because you can't pay it back, right? That is not helping. That's the same reason the IMF is forced on other countries, because it's debt slavery. And the fact that Iran's doing the same thing shows you that all governments are bad, guys. And regardless of what the overarching point is here, or the narrative, the lies flying around. All of these guys. The point of what I'm continually harping on the misinformation about Iran is to point out that our government, the country in which I live, the government of that country that I argue is rogue and shouldn't be there, is constantly lying about other people. But that doesn't mean the people they're lying about are not also doing bad things. These governments are problems. But see, that gets into a whole nother situation where I argue that governments in and of themselves are a problem. But that's, hard for people to wrap their minds around. Let's take it one step at a time and just make sure we can all see who the biggest problems are. But this kind of thing happening is bad, because all it's going to do is create more debt slavery for the people that are suffering only because of, in a lot of countries' cases today, because of their lack of response and because they didn't do what they were supposed to. And now we're suffering because of it, and now they're giving you loans, because that's lovely. We got to see this, guys, and I'm hoping people are beginning to pay attention. Thank you for being here and help me spread this information against the rising tide of just shouting down, gaslighting, screaming red-faced people calling you names because they don't want this to come out because you're lying or something, right? That's what's happening right now, and it's overwhelmingly obvious from every which direction. You got the left screaming down because of one thing, the right screaming down because of this, while they're all being deceived. The reality is, the facts are the facts, and it's time for you guys to help other people see that, which I know you're already doing out there. I know that most of you here are constantly trying to help spread the message, and I cannot thank you enough. But if you get mad, just walk away, because there's no point in getting into an aggressive conversation with someone who is not allowing information to get past their own preconceived ideas. I love you guys so much. Thank you for being here. Rocking the Question Everything t-shirt today seems incredibly relevant. If you'd like to support the channel, by the way, as always, all the links are in the show notes. Go to truthclothing.io if you want to buy a Question Everything t-shirt or a sticker like that one right there. Help support this channel and other independent channels such as Nathan's channel, as you guys know. Great company. I hope you guys will get out there and support everybody in the independent media, because that's what's needed today. I love you guys, as always. Question everything. Come to your own conclusions. Stay vigilant.
What was that?
There will be a briefing.
No briefing. Anyway, welcome to the State Department. I think we have some interns in the back. Welcome. Good to see you in this exercise in transparency and in democracy.
Is that what it is?
Sorry,
I
didn't mean to break
thought
out
it was an
laughter.
exercise in spin and obfuscation.